Hey, Fire. Or hey, John McDonald. How you doing?
Hard, but Stevens stood out on its back. She advanced across the pattern's foot, quite as if she meant to strike at Tarna. They defy me again. Again! I will have obedience, Tarna. I will have it. Write out an order, and once I sign and seal it, post it in every Aja's quarters. She stopped almost nose to nose with Tarna, her dark eyes glittering like a raven's eyes. The sitters of any Aja that fails to send its fair share of sisters to work on the chain towers will take a daily penance from Sylviana until the matter is rectified. Daily! And the sitters of any Aja that sends sisters to
Hell yeah.
those talks will
What
be
you
the
watching?
same. Write it out for me to sign. Tarna drew a deep breath. Penances might work and they might not, depending on how set the sitters were, and the Aja heads. She did not think things had gone so wrong that they might refuse to accept penance at all. That would be an end to Elida for sure, perhaps an end to the tower. But posting the order publicly, not allowing the sitters a scrap to hide behind and maintain their dignity, was the wrong way to go about it. In truth, it might well be the very worst way. If I may make a suggestion, she began as delicately as she could manage. She'd never been known for delicacy. You may not, Elida cut in harshly. She took another long drink, draining her goblet, and glided across the carpet to refill it. She drank too much of late. Tarna had even seen her drunk once. How is Sylviana doing with the Alvear girl? She said as she poured. Egwene spends near enough half of every day in Sylviana's study, Mother. She was careful to keep her tone neutral. This was the first time Elida had asked after the young woman since her capture, 9 days ago. So much? I want her tamed to the tower's harness, not broken. I doubt she will be broken, Mother. Sylviana will be careful of that. And then there was the girl herself. That was not for Elida's ears, though. Tarna had been shouted at more than enough. She'd learned to avoid subjects that only resulted in shouting. Advice and suggestions unoffered were no more useless than advice and suggestions untaken, and Elida almost never took either. Egwene's stubborn, but I expect she must come around soon. The girl had to. Galena, beating Tarna's block out of her, had not expended a tenth of the effort Sylviana was putting into Egwene. The girl had to yield to that soon. Excellent, Elida murmured. Excellent. She looked over her shoulder, her face a mask of serenity. Her eyes still glittered now. Put her name on the roster to attend me. In fact, have her attend me tonight. She can serve supper for Maidani and me. It will be as you command, Mother. It seemed yet another visit to the Mistress of Novices was inevitable, but no doubt Egwene would earn just as many of those if she never came near Elida. And now your reports, Tarna. Elida sat down again and crossed her legs. Replacing her barely touched goblet on the tray, Tarna took up her folder and sat in the chair Maidani had been using. The redone wards appeared to be keeping rats out of the tower, Mother. For how long was another question. She checked those wards herself every day. But ravens and crows have been seen in the tower grounds, so the wards on the walls must be.
The midday sun cast dappled light through the leafy branches of the tall trees, mostly oak and leatherleaf and sour gum, with a smattering of cottonwoods and massive pines. Apparently there had been a fierce windstorm some years back, because fallen timber, scattered about here and there but all stretched in the same direction, provided good seating with only a little hatchet work to hack away a few limbs. Sparse undergrowth allowed a good view in all directions, and not far off a small clear stream splashed over mossy stones. It would have been a good campsite if Matt had not been intent on covering as much ground as he could every day, but it did just as well as a place to rest the horses and eat. The Demona Mountains still lay at least 300 miles to the east, and he intended to reach them in a week. Bannon said he knew a smuggler's pass, purely by hearsay, of course, just something he had overheard by chance, but he knew right where to find it. They would have them inside Mirandy 2 days after that. Much safer than trying to go north into Andor or south toward Ilion. In either direction, the distance to safety would be further, and the chance of encountering Sean-Chan greater. Matt gnawed the last scrap of meat from a rabbit's hind leg and tossed the bone onto the ground. Balding Lopin darted in, stroking at his beard in consternation, to pick it up and drop it in the pit he and Narum had made in the mulch-covered forest floor, though the pit would be dug up by animals within a half hour after their departure. Matt moved to wipe his hands on his breeches. Tuan, nibbling at a grouse leg on the other side of the low fire, gave him a very direct look, her eyebrows raised, while the fingers of her free hand wiggled at Selucia, who had ravaged half a grouse by herself. The bosomy woman did not reply, but she sniffed, loudly. Meeting Tuan's gaze, he deliberately wiped his hands on his breeches again. He could have gone over to the stream where the Aes Sedai were washing their hands, but no one's clothing was going to be pristine by the time they reached Mirandy in any case. Besides, when a woman named you Toy all the time, it was natural to take any chance to let her know you were nobody's toy. She shook her head and waggled her fingers again.
Oh,
This
that's
time,
all good.
Selucia laughed, and Matt felt his face heat. He could imagine 2 or 3 things she might have said, none of which he would have enjoyed hearing. Satala, sitting on the end of his log, made sure he heard some of them anyway. Reaching an agreement with the one-time Aes Sedai had not shifted her attitudes a hair. She might have said men are pigs, she murmured without lifting her eyes from her embroidery hoop. Or just that you are. Her dark gray riding dress had a high neck, but she still wore her snug silver necklace with the marriage knife hanging from it. She may have said you're a mud-footed country lout with dirt in your ears and hay in your hair. Or she might have said, I think I see the direction you're going, he told her through gritted teeth. Tuan giggled, though the next instant her face belonged on an executioner once more, cold and stern. Pulling his silver-mounted pipe and goatskin tobacco pouch from his coat pocket, he thumbed the bowl full and lifted the lid on the box of strikers at his feet. It fascinated him the way fire just sprang up, spikes of it darting in all directions at first, when he scratched the lumpy red and white head of the striker down the rough side of the box. He waited until the flame burned away from the head before using it to light his pipe. Pulling the taste and smell of sulfur into his mouth once had been enough for him. He dropped the burning stick and ground it firmly under his boot. The mulch was still damp from the last rain to fall here, but he took no chances with fire in woods. In the 2 rivers, men turned out from miles around when the woods caught fire. Sometimes hundreds of marches burned even so. The strikers, they should not be wasted, Eludra said, lifting her eyes from the small stones board balanced atop a nearby log. Tom, stroking his long white mustaches, continued to contemplate the cross-hatched board. He rarely lost at stones, yet she had managed to win 2 games from him since they left the show. 2 out of a dozen or more, but Tom took care with anyone who could defeat him even once. She swept her beaded braids back over her shoulders. Me, I must be in the same place for 2 days to make more. Men always find ways to make work for women, yes? Matt puffed away, if not contentedly, at least with some degree of pleasure. Women, a delight to look at and a delight to be with, when they were not finding ways to rub salt into a man's hide. It seemed 6 up and a half dozen down. It truly did. Most of the party had finished eating. The best part of 2 grouse and 1 rabbit were all that remained on the spits over the fire, but they would be taken along wrapped in linen. The hunting had been good during the morning's ride, yet there was no certainty the afternoon would be as profitable, and flatbread and beans made a poor meal. Those who were finished were taking their ease, or, in the case of the Red Arms, checking the hobbled pack horses, better than 60 of them on 4 leads. Buying so many in Mandarin had been expensive, but Luca had rushed into town to take care of the bargaining himself once he had heard about a merchant dead in the street. He almost, but not quite, had been ready to give them pack horses from the show's animals to be rid of Matt after that. Many of the animals were loaded with Eludra's paraphernalia and her supplies. Luca had ended up with the greater part by far of Matt's gold one way and another. Matt had slipped a fat purse to Petra and Chlorine too, but that was friendship, to help them buy their inn a little sooner. What remained in his saddlebags was more than enough to see them comfortably to Murandy, though, and all he needed to replenish it was a common room where dice were being tossed. Lylewyn, with a curved sword hanging from a broad leather strap that slanted across her chest, and Doman, with a short sword on one side of his belt and a brass-studded cudgel on the other, were chatting with Julian and Amathera on yet another log close by. Lylewyn, he had come to accept that was the only name she would stomach, made a point of showing that she would not avoid Tuon or Selucia, or lower her eyes when they met, though she had to steel herself visibly to carry it off. Julian had the cuffs of his black coat turned back, a sign he felt among friends, or at least people he could trust. The one-time Panarch of Terrebonne still clutched the thief-catcher's arm tightly, but she met Lylewyn's sharp blue eyes with little flinching. In fact, she often seemed to gaze at the other woman with something approaching awe. Seated cross-legged on the ground and unmindful of the dampness, Noel was playing snakes and foxes with Olver and spinning wild tales about the lands beyond the Aiel Waste, about some great coastal city that foreigners were not allowed to leave, except by ship, and the inhabitants were not allowed to leave at all. Matt wished they would find another game to play. Every time they brought out that piece of red cloth with its spiderweb of black lines, it reminded him of his promise to Tom, reminded him the bloody eel fin were inside his head somehow, and maybe the flaming ale fin too. The Aes Sedai came up from the stream, and Jolene stopped to talk with Blerick and Fen. Gentleman and Sita, trailing along behind, hesitated until a gesture from the green sent them to stand behind the log where Tesslin and Edicina sat, as far apart as they could manage, with uncut branches between, and began reading small leather-bound books taken from their belt pouches. Both Bethamin and Sita stood behind Edicina. The yellow-haired former Suldam had come round in spectacular and painful fashion. Painful for her and for the sisters. When she first hesitantly asked them to teach her too, supper the night before, they refused. They were only teaching Bethamin because she had already channeled. Sita was too old to become a novice. She had not channeled, and that was that. So she duplicated whatever it was that Bethamin had done, and had all three leaping about the cook fire and squealing in showers of dancing sparks for as long as she could hold on to the power. They agreed to teach her then. At least Jolene and Edicina did. Tesslin still was having none of any Suldam, former or not. All three of them took a hand in switching her, though, and she had spent the morning continually easing herself in her saddle. She still looked afraid, of the one power and maybe of the Aes Sedai, but strangely, her face somehow seemed content, too. How to understand that was beyond Matt. He should have felt content himself. He had avoided a charge of murder, avoided riding blindly into a Sean-Chan trap that would have killed Tuon, and left the Golem behind for good this time. It would be following Luca's show, and Luca had been warned for whatever good that would do. In well under 2 weeks, he would be over the mountains into Murandy. The need to figure out how to get Tuon back to Abu Dar safely, no easy task at all now, especially since he would have to guard against Aes Sedai trying to spirit her away, would mean that much longer to look at her face, and to try puzzling out what went on behind those big, beautiful eyes. He should have been as happy as a goat in a corn crib. He was far from it. For one thing, all those sword cuts he had
Let's do a
received in
fresh
battling
dab.
hurt. Some of them were inflamed, though he had managed to keep that from anyone so far. He hated being fussed over nearly as much as he hated anyone using the power on him. Lopen and Nerim had sewed him up as well as they could, and he had refused healing despite attempted bullying by all three Aes Sedai. He had been surprised that Jolene, of all people, tried to insist, but she did, and flung up her hands in disgust when he failed to relent. Another surprise had been Tuon. "Don't be foolish, Toy," she had drawled in his tent, standing over him, arms folded beneath her breasts, while Lopen and Naren plied their needles, and he gritted his teeth. Her proprietary air, very much a woman making sure her property was repaired properly, had been enough to make him grind his teeth, never mind the needles. Or that he was down to his small clothes. She had just walked in and refused to leave short of manhandling, and he had felt in no condition to manhandle a woman he suspected might be able to break his arm. "This healing is a wonderful thing. My Mylan knows it, and I taught it to my others too. Of course, many people are foolish about having the power touch them. Half my servants would faint at the suggestion, and most of the blood, too. I shouldn't be surprised. But I wouldn't have expected it of you." If she had a quarter his experience of Aes Sedai, she would have. They had ridden off up the road from Madarin, as if setting out for Lugard, then taken to the forest as soon as the last farms were out of sight. The moment they entered the trees, the dice started up in his head again. That was the other thing that soured his mood, those bloody dice drumming inside his head for 2 days. There hardly seemed any way they could stop here in the forest. What kind of momentous event could happen in the woods? Still, he had stayed well clear of small villages they had passed. Sooner or later the dice would stop, though, and he could only wait for it. Tuon and Selucia headed for the stream to wash, wiggling their fingers at one another rapidly. Talking about him, he was sure. When women started putting their heads together, you could be sure. Amathera screamed, and every head whipped around toward her. Matt spotted the cause as quickly as Julian did. A black-scaled snake, a good 7 feet long, wriggling quickly away from the log Julian was seated on. Lylwyn cursed and leaped to her feet, drawing her sword, but no faster than Julian, who tugged his short sword free of its scabbard and started after the snake so swiftly that his conical red cap fell off. "Let it go, Julian," Matt said. "It's heading away from us. Let it go." The thing probably had a den under that log, and had been surprised to come out and find people. Luckily, black lances were solitary snakes. Julian hesitated before deciding that comforting a shivering Amathera was more important than chasing a snake. "What kind is it, anyway?" he said, folding her in his arms. He was a city man, after all. Matt told him, and for a moment he looked as though he meant to go after it again. Wisely, he decided against. Black lances were quick as lightning, and with a short sword he would have needed to get close. Anyway, Amathera was clinging to him so hard, he would have had a time getting free of her. Taking his hat from the butt of his Ashandarai, which was driven point down into the ground, Matt settled it on his head. "Daylight's wasting," he said around his pipe stem. "Time we were moving on. Don't dawdle over there, Tuon. Your hands are clean enough." He had tried calling her precious, but since her claim of victory back in Madarin, she refused to acknowledge that he had even spoken when he did. She did not hurry in the slightest, of course. By the time she returned, drying her small hands on a small piece of toweling that Selucia would drape across the pommel of her saddle to dry, Naren and Lopen had filled in the refuse pit, wrapped the remains of the meal, and tucked them into Naren's saddlebags, and doused the fire with water brought from the stream in folding leather buckets. Ashandarai in hand, Matt was ready to mount Pips. "A strange man who lets poisonous serpents go," Tuon said. "From the fellow's reaction, I assume a black lance is poisonous." "Very, brother. But snakes don't bite anything they can't eat, unless they're threatened." He put a foot in the stirrup. "You may kiss me, Toy." He gave a start. Her words, not spoken softly, had made them the object of every eye. Selucia's face was so stiffly expressionless, her disapproval could not have been plainer. "Now," he said, "when we stop tonight, we could take a stroll alone." "By tonight, I may have changed my mind, Toy. Call it a whim for a man who lets poisonous snakes go." Maybe she saw one of her omens in that? Taking off his hat and sticking the black spear back into the ground, He took the pipe from between his teeth and planted a chaste kiss on her full lips. A first kiss was nothing to be roughed with. He did not want her to think him pushy or crude. She was no tavern maid to enjoy a bit of slap and tickle. Besides, he could almost feel all those eyes watching. Someone snickered. Lucia rolled her eyes. Tuan folded her arms beneath her breasts and looked up at him through her long eyelashes. "Do I remind you of your sister?" she asked in a dangerous tone. "Or perhaps your mother?" Somebody laughed. More than one somebody, in fact. Grimly, Matt tapped the dottle from his pipe on the heel of his boot and stuffed the warm pipe into his coat pocket, leaving his hat back on the Ashandarai. If she wanted a real kiss, had he really thought she would not fill his arms? Slim, she was to be sure, and small, but she filled them very nicely indeed. He bent his head to hers. She was far from the first woman he had kissed. He knew what he was about. Surprisingly, or then again perhaps not so surprisingly, she did not. She was a quick tipper, though, very quick. When he finally released her, she stood there looking up at him and trying to catch her breath. For that matter, his breath came a little raggedly, too. Metwin whistled appreciatively. Matt smiled. What would she think of what plainly was her first real kiss ever? He tried not to smile too widely, though. He did not want her to think he was smirking. She laid fingers against his cheek. "I thought so," he said in that slow, honey drawl. "You're feverish. Some of your wounds must be infected." Matt blinked. He gave her a kiss that had to have curled her toes, and all she said was that his face was hot. He bent his head again. This time she would bloody well need help to stay standing, but she put a hand against his chest, fending him off. "Lucia, fetch the box of ointments I got from Mistress Luca," she commanded. Lucia went scurrying for Tuon's black and white mount. "We don't have time for that now," Matt said. "I'll smear on something tonight." He might as well have kept his mouth shut. "Strip off, boy," she said in the same tone she had used with her maid. "The ointment will sting, but I expect you to be brave." "I am not going to—" "Rider's coming," Arnon announced. He was already in his saddle, on a dark bay gelding with white forefeet, holding the lead to one of the strings of pack horses. "One of them's Vannon." Matt swung up onto Pips for a better vantage. A pair of horsemen were approaching at a gallop, dodging around fallen trees when they had to. Aside from recognizing Chell Vannon's dun, there was no mistaking the man himself. Nobody else who was that wide and sat his saddle like a sack of suet could have maintained his seat at that pace without any apparent effort. The man could have stayed in his saddle on a wild boar. Then Matt recognized the other rider, whose cloak was flailing behind him, and felt as if he had been punched in the belly. He would not have been surprised in the least had the dice stopped then, but they kept bouncing off the inside of his skull. What in the light was Talmanis bloody well doing in Altara? The two riders slowed to a walk short of Matt, and Bannon reined in to let Talmanis approach alone. It was not shyness. There was nothing shy about Bannon. He leaned lazily on the tall pommel of his saddle and spat to one side through a gap in his teeth. No, he knew Matt would not be best pleased, and he meant to stay clear. "Bannon brought me up to date, Matt," Talmanis said. Short and wiry, with the front of his head shaved and powdered, the Kyrienan had the right to wear stripes of color across his chest in considerable number, but a small red hand sewn to the back of his dark coat was its only decoration, unless you counted the long red scarf tied around his left arm. He never laughed and seldom smiled, but he had his reasons. "I was sorry to hear about Nalisian and the others. A good man, Nalisian. They all were." "Yes, they were," Matt said, keeping a tight rein on his temper. "I assume Egwene never came to you for help getting away from those fool Aes Sedai?" Or what in the bloody flaming light are you doing here? Well, maybe he did not have such a tight rein after all. At least tell me you haven't brought the whole bloody band 300 bloody miles into Altara with you. Egwene is still the Amerlin, the other man said calmly, straightening his cloak. Another red hand, larger, marked that. You were wrong about her, Matt. She really is the Amerlin seat. And she has those Aes Sedai by the scruff of the neck, though some of them might not know it yet. The last I saw, she and the whole lot of them were off to besiege Tarvalon. She might have it by now. They can make holes in the air like the one the Dragon Reborn made to take us near Saladar. The colors spun in Matt's head, resolving for an instant into Rand talking to some woman with gray hair and a bun atop her head. An Aes Sedai, he thought, but his anger blew the image away like mist. All that talk of the Amerlin seat in Tarvalon attracted the sisters, of course. They heeled their horses up beside Matt and tried to take over. Well, Edicina hung back a little the way she did when Teslin or Jolene had the bit in her teeth. The other two... Who do you be talking about? Teslin demanded while Jolene was still opening her mouth. Egwene. There did be an accepted named Egwene Alvier, but she be a runaway. Egwene Alvier is the one, Aes Sedai, Talmanas said politely. The man was always polite to Aes Sedai. And she is no runaway. She is the Amerlin seat, my word on it. Edicina made a sound that would have been called a squeak coming from anyone but an Aes Sedai. Later for that, Matt muttered. Jolene opened her mouth again, angrily. Later, I said. That was not enough to stop the slender green, but Teslin laid a hand on her arm and murmured something, and that was. Jolene still glared daggers, though, promising to drag out everything she wanted to know later. The band, Talmanas? Oh, no, I only brought 3 banners of horse and 4,000 mounted crossbowmen. I left 3 banners of horse and 5 of foot, a little short of crossbows, in Murundi with orders to move north to Andor. And the Masons' banner, of course. And you'd have Masons ready to hand if you need a bridge built or the like. Matt squeezed his eyes shut for a moment. 6 banners of horse and 5 of foot. And a banner of Masons? The band had only been 2 banners, counting horse and foot, when he left them in Saladar. He wished he had back half the gold he had handed over to Lucas so freely. How am I supposed to pay that many men? He demanded. I couldn't find enough dice games in a year. Well, as to that, I made a small deal with King Rodron. Finished with now, and not before time. I think he was about ready to turn on us. I will explain later. But the band's coffers hold a year's pay and more. Besides, sooner or later the Dragon Reborn will give you estates, and grand ones. He has raised men to rule nations, so I hear, and you grew up with him. This time he did not fight the colors as they resolved into Rand and the Aes Sedai. It was an Aes Sedai for sure. A hard woman she looked. If Rand tried to give him any titles, he would stuff them down Rand's bloody throat, is what he would do. Matt Coffin had no liking for nobles. Well, a few like Talmanas were all right, and Tuon. Never forget Tuon. And he certainly had no bloody desire to become one. That's as may be, was all he said, though. Selusha cleared her throat loudly. She and Tuon moved their horses up beside Matt, and Tuon was so straight in her mare's saddle, so cool-eyed, cold-faced, and regal that he expected Selusha to start proclaiming her titles. She did nothing of the sort. Instead, she shifted on her dung and scowled at him, eyes like blue coals in a fire, then cleared her throat again, very loudly. Ah. Tuon, Matt said, allow me to present Lord Talmanas de Lavinda of Cairhien. His family is distinguished and ancient, and he has added honors to its name. The little woman inclined her head, perhaps all of an inch. Talmanas, this is Tuon. So long as she called him Toy, she would get no titles from him. Selusha glared, eyes hotter than ever, impossible as that seemed. Talmanas blinked in surprise, though, and bowed very low in his saddle. Vannon pulled the sagging brim of his hat lower, half hiding his face. He still avoided looking directly at Matt. So, it seemed the man had already told Talmanis exactly who Tuan was. Growling under his breath, Matt leaned from the saddle to snatch his hat from the spear and pull up the Ashandarai. He clapped the hat on his head. We were ready to move on, Talmanis. Take us to where your men are waiting, and we'll see if we can have as good luck avoiding Shan on the way out of Altara as you had on the way in. We saw a good many Shan, Talmanis said, turning his bay to fall in beside Pip's. Though most of the men we saw seemed to be Altaran. They have camps scattered everywhere, it seems. Luckily, we saw none of those flying creatures I have heard tell of. But there is a problem, Matt. There was a landslide. I lost my rear guard and some of the pack horses. The pass is well and truly blocked, Matt. I sent 3 men to try climbing over with the orders sending the band to Andor. One broke his neck and another his leg. Matt stopped Pip short. I'm guessing this is the same pass Vannon was talking about? Talmanis nodded, and Vannon, waiting to fall in farther back, said, Bloody right it was. Passes don't grow on trees, not in mountains like the Damonas. He was no respecter of rank. Then you'll have to find another one, Matt told him. I've heard you can find your way blindfolded at midnight. It should be easy for you. Flattery never hurt. Besides, he had heard that about the man. Vannon made a sound like he was swallowing his tongue. Find another pass, he muttered. Find another pass, the man says. You don't just go find another pass in new mountains like the Damonas. Why do you think I only knew the one? He was shaken to admit that much. Before this, he had been adamant that he had only heard of it. What are you talking about? Matt demanded, and Vannon explained, at great length for him. And Aes Sedai explained it to me once. You see, there's old mountains. They was there before the breaking, maybe on the bottom of the sea or the like. They have passes all over, broad and gentle. You can ride into those, and as long as you keep your head in your direction and have enough supplies, sooner or later you come out the other side. And then there's mountains made during the breaking. The fat man turned his head and spat copiously. Passes in those are narrow, twisty things, and sometimes they aren't really what you'd call passes at all. Ride into one of those and you can wander around till your food runs out trying to find a way to the other side. Loss of that pass is going to hurt a lot of folks who use it for what you might call untaxed goods. And men will die before they find a new one that gets them all the way through. We go into the Damonas with that pass gone, likely we'll all die too. Them as doesn't turn back in time and hasn't gotten their heads so turned around they can't find a way back. Matt looked around at Tuan, the Aes Sedai, at Olver. They were all depending on him to get them to safety, but his safe route out of Altara was not there anymore. Let's ride, he said. I have to think. He had to bloody think for all he was worth.
Chapter 26. As if the world were fog. Toys at a fast pace through the forest, but Tuan rode close behind him, with Selusha at her side, of course, so she could listen in on him and Talmanis. Her own thoughts interfered with eavesdropping, however. So he had grown up with the Dragon Reborn, had he? The Dragon Reborn. And he had denied knowing anything at all of the man. That was one lie of his she had failed to catch, and she was good at catching lies. In Shandar, the undetected lie might be the one that killed you, or sent you to the sail block as property. Had she known of his prevarication, she might have slapped his face, rather than allowing him to kiss her. Now that had been a shock, one she was not sure she had recovered from yet. Selusha had described being kissed by a man, but the actuality made the other woman's descriptions pale. No, she had to listen. You left Estion in charge? Toy erupted so loudly that the covey of grey doves burst from cover in the thin undergrowth with a mournful whirring sound. "The man's a fool!" "Not too much of a fool to listen to Daerid," Talmanis replied calmly. He did not seem a man to get overly excited. He kept a careful watch, head swiveling constantly. Every so often he scanned the sky through the thick branches overhead, too. He had only heard of Rakan, yet he watched for them. His words were even crisper and quicker than Toy's, and difficult to follow. His people all spoke so fast. "Carloman and Ryman are not fools, Matt. At least Ryman is only a fool sometimes. But neither will they listen to a commoner, no matter how much more he knows about warfare than they do. Edorian will, but I wanted him with me." That red hand symbol Talmanis wore was intriguing, more than intriguing, much more. Of an old and distinguished house, was he? A Toy was the one. He remembered Hawkwing's face. That seemed utterly impossible, yet his denial of it had plainly been a lie, as plain as the spots on a leopard. Could the red hand be Toy's sigil? But if so, what about his ring? She'd almost fainted when she first saw that. Well, she had come as close to it as she had since childhood. "That's going to change, Talmanis," Toy growled. "I let it go on too long as it is. If Ryman and the others command banners now, that makes them banner generals, and you a lieutenant general. Daerid commands 5 banners, and that makes him a lieutenant general too. Ryman and the others will obey his orders or they can go home. Come Tarman Gaiden, I'm not going to have my skull split open because they bloody refuse to listen to somebody who doesn't have bloody estates." Talmanis turned his horse to ride around a patch of briars, and everyone followed. The tangled vines seemed to have particularly long thorns, and hooked besides. "They will not like it, Matt, but they will not go home either. You know that. Have you any ideas yet how we are to get out of Altara?" "I'm thinking on it," Toy muttered. "I'm thinking on it. Those crossbowmen—" He exhaled heavily. "That wasn't wise, Talmanis. For one thing, they're used to marching on their own feet. Half of them will have all they can do to stay in the saddle if we're moving fast, and we're going to have to. They can be useful in woods like these or anywhere they have plenty of cover, but if we're on open ground with no pikes, they'll be ridden down before they can lose a second flight." In the distance, a lion coughed. In the distance. But it was still enough to make the horses whicker nervously and dance a few steps. Toy leaned forward on his gelding's neck and appeared to whisper in the animal's ear. It quieted immediately. So that had not been another of his fanciful tales after all. Remarkable. "I picked men who could ride, Matt," Talmanis said once his bay stopped frisking. "And they all have the new crank." A touch of excitement entered his voice now. Even restrained men tended to warmth over weapons. 3 turns of the crank. His hands moved in a quick circle, demonstrating. And the bowstring is latched. With a little training, a man can get off 7 or 8 quarrels in a minute, with a heavy crossbow. Solutia made a small sound in her throat. She was right to be startled. If Talmanis was telling the truth, and he had no reason to lie that Tuon could find, then she had to obtain one of these marvelous cranks somehow. With one for a pattern, artisans could make more. Archers could shoot faster than crossbowmen, but they took longer to train, too. There were always more crossbowmen than archers. 7? Toy exclaimed incredulously. That would be more than useful, but I never heard of such a thing. Ever. He muttered that as if it had some special significance, then shook his head. How did you come by it? 7 or 8. There was a mechanic in Murandy who wanted to take a wagon load of things he had invented up to Caneland. There is a school of some sort there for scholars and inventors. He needed money for the journey, and he was willing to teach the band's armorers to make the things. Smother your enemy with arrows at every opportunity. It is always better to kill your enemies far off than close at hand. Solutia held her hands up so Tuon could see them, slim fingers moving quickly. What is this band they speak of? She used the proper form, inferior to superior, yet her impatience was almost palpable. Impatience with everything that was happening. Tuon kept few secrets from her, but some seemed advisable for the present. She would not put it past Selusha to return her to Ebu Dar forcibly, so she would not be breaking her word. A shadow's duties were many, and sometimes required paying the final sacrifice. She did not want to have to order Selusha's execution. She replied in the imperative form. Toy's personal army, obviously. Listen, and we may learn more. Toy commanding an army seemed very odd. He was charming at times, even witty and amusing, but often a buffoon and always a rapscallion. He had seemed very much in his element as Tylan's pet. Yet he had seemed in his element among the show's performers, too, and with the Maroth Damani and the two escaped Damani, and in the Hell. That had been such a disappointment. Not even one fight. Events later had not compensated for that. Getting swept up in a street brawl was hardly the same as seeing fights in a hell, which admittedly had been far more boring than rumor heard in Ebu Dar had made it seem. Toy had displayed an unexpected side of himself in that street brawl, a formidable man, though with a peculiar weakness. For some reason she found that strangely endearing. Good advice, he said absently, tugging at the black scarf tied around his neck. She wondered about the scar he took such pains to hide. That he did was understandable. Why had he been hanged, and how had he survived? She could not ask. She did not mind lowering his eyes a little. In fact, it was enjoyable making him writhe. It took so little effort. But she did not want to destroy him. At least, not for the moment. You not recognize it? Talmanis said. It is from your book. King Roedran has 2 copies in his library. He has it memorized. The man thinks it will make him a great captain. He was so pleased with how our bargain worked out that he had a copy printed and bound for me. Toy gave the other man a mystified look. My book? The one you told us about, Matt. Fog and Steel, by Madak Comadrin. Oh, that book. Toy shrugged. I read it a long time ago. Tuon gritted her teeth. Her fingers flashed. When will they stop talking of books and go back to interesting things? Perhaps if we're listening we may learn more, Selusha replied. Tuon glared at her, but the woman wore such an innocent look that she could not maintain her scowl. She laughed, softly, so as not to let Toy realize how close behind him she was, and Selusha joined in, softly. Toy had fallen silent, though, and Talmanis seemed content to leave it so. They rode in silence, save for the sounds of the forest, birds singing, strange black-tailed squirrels chittering on branches. Tuon set herself to watching for omens, but nothing caught her eye. Bright-feathered birds darted among the trees. Once they spotted a herd of perhaps 50 tall, lean cattle with very long horns that stuck out almost straight to either side. The animals had heard them coming and were squared up, facing them. A bull tossed his head and pawed at the ground. Toy and Talmanis led the careful way around the herd, keeping their distance. She looked over her shoulder. The Red Arms. Why were they called that? She would have to ask Toy. The Red Arms were leading the pack horses, but Gordoran had raised his crossbow and the others had arrows knocked to their bows. So these cattle were dangerous. There were few omens concerning cattle, and she was relieved when the herd dwindled behind them. She had not come all this way to be killed by a cow, or to see Toy killed by one. After a time, Tom and Aludra came up to ride beside her. The woman glanced at her once, then looked straight ahead. The Taraboner's face, framed by those brightly beaded braids, was always wooden when she looked at her or Selusha. So clearly she was one of those who refused to accept the return. She was watching Toy, and she looked satisfied, as if something had been confirmed for her, perhaps. Why had Toy brought her along? Surely not for her fireworks. Those were pretty enough, but they could not compare with skylights performed by even a half-trained Damani. Tom Maryland was much more interesting. Patently, the white-haired old man was an experienced spy. Who had sent him to Ebu Dar? The White Tower seemed the most obvious candidate. He spent little time around the 3 who called themselves Aes Sedai, but a well-trained spy would not get himself away in that fashion. His presence troubled her. Until the last Aes Sedai was leashed, the White Tower was something to be wary of. Despite everything, she still had troubling thoughts at times that somehow Toy was part of a White Tower plot. That was impossible, unless some of the Aes Sedai were omniscient, yet the thought sometimes came to her. "A strange coincidence, wouldn't you say, Master Merlin?" she said. "Encountering part of Toy's army in the middle of an Altaran forest." He stroked his long mustaches with a knuckle, failing to mask a small smile. "He's Taviran, my lady, and you can never tell what will happen around a Taviran. It's always interesting when you travel with one of those. Matt has a tendency to find what he needs when he needs it, sometimes before he knows he needs it." She stared at him, but he seemed serious. "He's tied to the pattern?" That was how the word would translate. "What is that supposed to mean?" The old man's blue eyes widened in astonishment. "You don't know?" "But it said Arthur Hawkley was the strongest Taviran anyone had ever seen, perhaps as strong as Randall Thor. I'd have thought you, of all people, would—" "Well, if you don't, you don't. Taviran are people the pattern shapes itself around, people who were spun out by the pattern itself to maintain the proper course of the weaving, perhaps to correct flaws that were creeping in. One of the Aes Sedai could explain better than I." As if she would have conversation with a Marth Damani, or worse, a runaway Damani. "Thank you," she told him politely. "I think I've heard enough." Taviran. Ridiculous. These people and their endless superstitions. A small brown bird, surely a finch, flew out of a tall oak and circled Widdershins 3 times above Toy's head before flying on. She had found her omen. Stay close to Toy. Not that she had any intention of doing otherwise. She had given her word, playing the game as it had to be played, and she had never broken her word in her life. Little more than an hour after setting out, as a bird warbled ahead, Selusha pointed out the first sentry, a man with a crossbow up in the thick branches of a spreading oak, cupping a hand to his mouth. Not a bird, then. More bird calls heralded their advance, and soon they were riding through a tidy encampment. There were no tents, but the lances were neatly stacked, the horses picketed on scattered lines among the trees, near to the blankets of the men who would ride them, with a saddle or pack saddle at every animal's head. It would not take long for them to break camp and be on the march. Their fires were small and gave off little smoke. As they rode in, men in dull green breastplates with that red hand on their coat sleeves and red scarves tied to their left arms began rising to their feet. She saw grizzled faces with scars and fresh young faces, all with their eyes on Toy and expressions she could only call eager. A growing murmur of voices rose, rustling through the trees like a breeze. "It's Lord Matt. Lord Matt is back. Lord Matt's found us. Lord Matt!" Tuon exchanged glances with Selusha. The affection in those voices was unfeigned. That was rare, and often went with a commander who had a slack hand at discipline. But then she expected any army of toys to be a ragtag affair, full of men who spent their time drinking and gambling. Only these men looked no more ragtag than any regiment that had crossed a mountain range and ridden several 100 miles. No one looked unsteady on his feet with drink. "Mostly we camp during the day and move at night to avoid being seen by the Shongshan," Talmana said to Toy. "Just because we have seen none of those flying beasts does not mean some might not be around. Most of the Shongshan seem to be farther north or farther south, but apparently they have a camp not 30 miles north of here, and rumor says there is one of the creatures there." "You seem pretty well informed," Toy said, studying the soldiers they passed. He nodded suddenly, as if he had reached a decision. He seemed grim, and could it be resigned? "I am Matt. I brought half the scouts, and I also signed some Altarans who were fighting the Shongshan. Well, most of them seem to have been stealing horses more than anything else, but some were willing to give that up for a chance to really fight them. I think I know where most of the Shanshan camps are, from the Malvide Narrows south to here. Suddenly a man began to sing in a deep voice, and others joined in, the song spreading rapidly. There's some delight in ale and wine, and some in girls with ankles fine. But my delight, yes, always mine, is to dance with Jack of the Shadows. Every man in the camp was singing now, thousands of voices roaring the song. We'll toss the dice however they fall, and snuggle the girls be they short or tall, then follow Lord Nat whenever he calls, to dance with Jack of the Shadows. They finished with shouts, laughing and clapping one another on the shoulder. Who under the light was this Jack of the Shadows? Reining in, Toy raised the hand holding his odd spear. That was all, yet silence spread through the soldiers. So he was not soft with discipline. There were a few other reasons for soldiers to be fond of their officers, but the most common seemed unlikely to apply to Toy of all people. Let's not let them know we're here until we want them to know, Toy said loudly. He was not orating, just making sure his voice carried. And the men heard, repeating his words over their shoulders to be passed back to men beyond the sound of his voice. We're a long way from home, but I mean to get us home. So be ready to move, and move fast. The band of the Red Hand can move faster than anybody else, and we're going to have to prove it. There was no cheering, but plenty of nods. Turning to Talmanas, he said, Do you have maps? The best to be found, Talmanas replied. The band has its own map maker now. Master Roy Dell already had good maps of everything from the Arith Ocean to the spine of the world, and since we crossed the Damonas, he and his assistants have been making new maps of the country we crossed. They even marked a map of eastern Altara with what we have learned of the Shanshan. Most of those camps are temporary, though. Soldiers heading somewhere else. Selusha shifted in her saddle, and Tuan signed, Patience, in high imperative form, a command. She kept her face smooth, but inside she was furious. Knowing where soldiers were gave clues to where they were going. There had to be some way to burn that map. That would be as important as laying hands on one of the crossbow cranks. I'll want to talk with Master Roydell, too, Toy said. Soldiers came to take the horses, and for a while all seemed confusion and milling about. A gap-toothed fellow took Akaim's reins, and Tuan gave him explicit instructions on caring for the mare. He returned her a sour look along with his bow. Commoners in these lands seemed to believe themselves equal to everyone. Selusha gave the same sort of instructions to the lanky young man who took Rosebud. She thought that an appropriate name for a dresser's horse. The young man stared at Selusha's chest until she slapped him hard. He only grinned and led the dun away, rubbing his cheek. Tuan sighed. That was all very well for Selusha, but for herself, striking a commoner would lower her eyes for months. Soon enough, though, she was settled on a folding stool with Selusha at her back, and stout Lopin presented them with tin cups full of dark tea, bowing quite properly to Selusha as well as to her. Not deeply enough, but the balding man did try. Her tea was honeyed to perfection, lightly, but then he had served her often enough to know how she liked it. Activity bustled about them. Talmanas had a brief reunion with gray-haired Naram, who apparently was his serving man, and happy to be reunited with him. At least the thin man's normally mournful countenance actually flashed a momentary smile. That sort of thing should have been done in private. Lylewyn and Doman allowed Master Charan to lead Olveroff to explore the camp with Julian and Farah. Tom and Aludra went too, to stretch their legs, then deliberately took stools close by. Lylewyn even went so far as to stare unblinking at Tuan for a long moment. Selusha made a low sound, very like a growl, but Tuan ignored the provocation and gestured Mistress Anand to bring her stool over beside her. Eventually the traitors would be punished, and the thief, the property restored to its rightful owners, and the Marathtamani leashed. But those things had to wait on what was more important. 3 more officers appeared, young noblemen with that red hand on their dark silk coats, and had their own reunion with Toy, with a great deal of laughing and hitting each other on the shoulder, which they seemed to take as a sign of fondness. She soon had them sorted out. Adorian was the dark, lean man with the serious expression, except when smiling. Ryman, the broad-shouldered fellow who smiled a great deal, and Carloman, the tall, slender one. Adorian was clean-shaven, while Ryman and Carloman both had dark beards that were trimmed to points and glistened as if oiled. All three made much over the Aes Sedai, bowing deeply. They even bowed to Bethamin and Sita. Tuon shook her head. "I've told you often enough it's a different world than you're used to," Mistress Annan murmured. "But you still don't quite believe it, do you?" "Just because a thing is a certain way," Tuon replied, "doesn't mean it should be that way, even if it has been for a long time." "Some might say the same of your people, my lady." "Some might." Tuon let it rest there, though she usually enjoyed her private conversations with the woman. Mistress Annan argued against leashing Marath Damani, as might be expected, and even against keeping Dako Vale of all things. Yet they were discussions rather than arguments, and Tuon had made her concede a few points. She had hopes of bringing the woman around eventually. Not today, though. She wanted her mind focused on Toy. Master Roydell appeared, a graying, round-faced man whose bulk strained his dark coat, followed by 6 fit-appearing younger men, each carrying a long cylindrical leather case. "I brought all the maps of Altara I have, my lord," he told Talmanis in a musical accent as he bowed. Did everyone in these lands speak as if racing to get the words out? "Some cover the whole country, they do, some no more than 100 square miles. The best are my own, of course, those I made these past weeks." "Lord Matt will tell you what he wants to see," Talmanis said. "Shall we leave you to it, Matt?" But Toy was already telling the map maker what he wanted. The map marked with the Shongshan camps. In short order it was sorted out from the others in one of the cases and spread on the ground, with Toy squatting on his heels beside it. Master Roydell sent one of his assistants running to fetch him a stool. He would have burst his coat buttons trying to imitate Toy, and likely have fallen over besides. Tuon stared at that map hungrily. How to get her hands on it? Exchanging glances and laughing as if being snubbed were the funniest thing in the world, Talmanis and the other 3 men strolled toward Tuon. The Aes Sedai gathered around the map on the ground until Toy told them to quit peering over his shoulder. They moved off a little, Bethamin and Sita heeling them at a distance, and began talking quietly among themselves, occasionally glancing in his direction. If Toy had been paying any heed to their expressions, especially Jolene's, he might have been worried in spite of the incredible Terangrial Mistress Annan said he carried. "We're about here, right?" he said, marking a spot with his finger. Master Roydell murmured that they were. "So this is the camp where the Rockin supposedly is? The flying beast?" Another murmur of assent. "Good. What kind of camp is it? How many men are there?" "Reportedly it's a supply camp, my lord, for resupplying patrols." The young man returned with another folding stool, and the stout man eased himself down with a grunt. "Supposedly about 100 soldiers, mostly Altaran, and about 200 laborers, but I'm told there can be as many as 500 more soldiers at times." "A careful man, Master Roydell." Talmanis made one of those odd bows with one foot forward, and the other 3 mirrored him. "My lady," Talmanis said, "Vanin told me of your circumstances and the promises Lord Matt made. I just want to tell you he keeps his word." "That he does, my lady," Adorian murmured. "Always." Tuon motioned him to step aside so she could continue to watch Toy, and he did so with a surprised glance at Toy and another for her. She gave him a stern look. The last thing she wanted was for these men to start imagining things. Not everything had fallen out as it had to yet. There was still a chance this could all go awry. "Is he a lord or is he not?" she demanded. "Excuse me," Talmanis said, "but would you say that again? I apologize. I must have dirt in my ears."
Right back.
She repeated herself carefully, but it still took them a minute to puzzle out what she had said. "Burn my soul, no," Ryman said finally with a laugh. He stroked his beard. "Except to us. Lord enough for us." "He dislikes nobles for the most part," Carloman said. "I count it an honor to be among the few he doesn't dislike." "An honor," Ryman agreed. Adorian contented himself with nodding. "Soldiers, Master Roydell," Toy said firmly. "Show me where the soldiers are. and more than any few hundred. What is he doing? Tuan said, frowning. He can't think to sneak this many men out of Altara, even if he knows where every last soldier is. There are always patrols and sweeps by rock, and again they took their time before answering. Perhaps she should try speaking very fast. We've seen no patrols in better than 300 miles, and no rockin'? No rockin', Edorian said quietly. He was studying her. Too late to stop his imaginings. Ryman laughed again. If I know Matt, he's planning us a battle. The band of the Red Hand rides to battle again. It's been too long, if you ask me. Selucia sniffed, and so did Mistress Amun. Tuan had to agree with them. A battle won't get you out of Altara, she said sharply. In that case, Talmanis said, he's planning us a war. The other three nodded agreement as if that were the most normal thing under the light. Ryman even laughed. He seemed to think everything was humorous. 3,000? Tori said. You're sure? Sure enough, Matt. Sure enough will do. Vannin can locate them if they haven't moved too far. Tuan looked at him, squatting there by the map, moving his fingers over its surface, and suddenly she saw him in a new light. A buffoon? No. A lion stuffed into a horse stall might look like a peculiar joke, but a lion on the high plains was something very different. Toy was loose on the high plains now. She felt a chill. What sort of man had she entangled herself with? After all this time, she realized, she had hardly a clue.
The night was cool enough to send a small shiver through Perrin whenever the breeze gusted despite his fur-lined cloak. A halo around the fat crescent moon said there would be more rain before long. Thick clouds drifting across the moon made the pale light dim and strengthen, yet it was enough for his eyes. He sat stepper just inside the edge of the trees and watched the cluster of 4 tall gray stone windmills in a clearing atop the ridge, their pale sails gleaming and shadowed by turns as they rotated. The machinery of the windmills groaned loudly. It seemed doubtful the Shido even knew they should grease the works of the things. The stone aqueduct was a dark bar stretching east on high stone arches, past abandoned farms and rail-fenced fields, the Shido had planted, too early with this much rain, toward another ridge and the lake beyond. Malden lay one more ridge west. He eased the heavy hammer in its loop on his belt. Malden and Fail. In a few hours, he would add a 54th knot to the leather cord in his pocket. He cast his mind out. Are you ready, Snowy Dawn? He thought. Are you close enough yet? Wolves avoided towns, and with Shido hunting parties in the surrounding forest during the day, they stayed further from Malden than usual. Patience, young bull, came the reply, touched with irritation. But then Snowy Dawn was irascible by nature, a scarred male of considerable age for a wolf who had once killed a leopard by himself. Those old injuries sometimes kept him from sleeping very long at a stretch. 2 days from now, you said. We will be there. Now let me try to sleep. We must hunt well tomorrow, since we cannot hunt the day after. They were images and smells, rather than words, of course. 2 days was the sun crossing the sky twice. The hunt, a pack trotting with noses into the breeze, blended with the scent of deer. But Perrin's mind converted the images to words even as he saw them in his head. Patience, yes. Haste spoiled the work. But it was hard now that he was so close, very hard. A form appeared from the dark door at the base of the nearest windmill and waved my eel spear back and forth overhead. The groaning had convinced him the windmills must still be deserted. They had been when the maidens scouted them earlier, and no one would put up with that noise any longer than they had to. But he had sent Gaul and some of the maidens to be sure one way or another. Let's go, Mishima, he said, gathering his reins. It's done. One way or another. How can you make out anything? Pt.14 muttered. He avoided looking at Perrin, whose golden eyes would be glowing in the night. That had made the scarred man jump the first time he saw it. He did not smell amused tonight. He smelled tense, but he called softly over his shoulder. Bring the carts ahead. Quickly now, quickly. And be quiet about it, or I'll have your ears. Perrin heeled his dumb stallion forward without waiting on the others or the 6 high-wheeled carts. Liberally greased axles made them as quiet as carts could be. They still sounded noisy to him, the cart horses' hooves squelching in the mud, the carts themselves creaking as wood flexed and rubbed, but he doubted anyone else could have heard them 50 paces off, and maybe not closer. At the top of the gentle slope, he dismounted and let Stepper's reins fall. A trained warhorse, the stallion would stand there as if hobbled so long as his reins hung down. The windmill heads squealed, turning slightly as the breeze shifted. The slowly spinning arms were long enough that Perrin could have touched one by jumping when it swung well. He stared toward the last ridge that hid Malden. Nothing grew there taller than a bush. Nothing moved in the darkness. Just one ridge between him and Faio. The maidens had come outside to join Gaul, all of them still veiled. There was no one, Gaul said, not quietly. This close, the grinding of the windmill's gears would have swallowed quiet words. The dust has not been disturbed since I was here last, Sulin added. Perrin scratched his beard, just as well. Had they needed to kill Shido, they could have carried away the bodies, but the dead would have been missed, and it would have drawn attention to the windmills and aqueduct. It might have started someone thinking about the water. Help me get the lids off, Gaul. There was no need for him to do that. It would save only minutes, but he needed to be doing something. Gaul simply stuck his spear through the harness holding his bow case to join the others on his back. The aqueduct ran along the ground on the ridgetop between the 4 windmills and stood shoulder high on Perrin, less on Gaul, who climbed over. Just beyond the last pair of windmills, bronze handles on either side allowed them to lift off heavy pieces of stone 2 feet wide and 5 feet long until they cleared a stretch of 6 feet. What the opening was used for, he did not know. There was another like it on the other side, maybe to work on the flaps that made sure water flowed only one way, or to get inside to repair any leaks. He could see small ripples of motion as it streamed toward Malden, filling more than half the stone channel. Mishima joined them and dismounted to stand peering uncertainly at Sulin and the maidens. He probably believed the night hid his expression. He smelled wary now. He was followed quickly by the first of the red-coated Shonchan soldiers scrambling up the muddy slope, each carrying 2 middling-sized jute sacks. Middling, but not heavy. Each contained only 10 pounds. Eyeing the Aiel suspiciously, the wiry woman set her sacks down and slashed one open with her dagger. A handful of fine, dark grains spilled on the muddy ground. Do that over the opening, Perrin said. Make sure every grain goes into the water. The wiry woman looked to Mishima, who said firmly, Do as Lord Perrin commands, Arata. Perrin watched as she emptied the sack into the aqueduct, hands lifted over her head. The dark grains floated away toward Malden. He had dropped a pinch into a cup of water, hating to waste even that, and they took some time to absorb enough water to sink, long enough to reach the big cistern in the town, he hoped. And if not, they could steep in the aqueduct itself. The cistern would still turn to forkroot tea eventually. The light said it would be strong enough. With luck, maybe even strong enough to affect the Algad Siswai. The wise ones who could channel were his target, but he would take any advantage he could gain. The light send did not grow strong faster than he expected. If those wise ones began staggering too soon, they might puzzle out the cause before he was ready. And all he could do was go ahead as if he knew exactly that and pray. By the time the second sack was being poured into the stone channel, the others began crowding up the slope. First came Sionid, a short woman holding her dark divided skirts up out of the mud. Shifting his attention from the maidens to her, Mishima made one of those small gestures to ward off evil. Strange that they could believe a thing like that worked. The soldiers lined up with their sacks stared at her, wide-eyed for the most part, and shifted their feet. The Shonchan were none too easy about working with Aes Sedai. Her warders, Fiorin and Terrell, were at her heels, each with a hand resting on his sword hilt. They were just as easy about the Shonchan. The one was dark with gray streaking his curly black beard, the other fair and young with curled mustaches, yet they were alike as two beams, tall, lean, and hard. Robert Kirkland came a little behind them, a compact man with dark receding hair and a glum expression. He did not like being separated from Missouri. All three of the men had small bundles containing food strapped to their backs and fat water skins hanging from their shoulders. A lanky man rested his sacks on the side of the opening as the wiry woman headed down slope to fetch more. The carts were piled high with them. "Remember," Perrin told Sionin, "the biggest danger will be getting from the cistern to the fortress. You'll have to use the guard walk on the wall, and there might be Shido in the town even at this hour." Alice had seemed unsure on that. Thunder boomed hollowly in the distance, then again. "Maybe you'll have rain to hide you." "Thank you," she said icily. Her moon-shadowed face was a mask of Aes Sedai serenity, but her scent spiked with indignation. "I would not have known any of that if you had not told me." The next moment her expression softened and she laid a hand on his arm. "I know you are worried about her. We will do what can be done." Her tone was not exactly warm, it never was, but not so chill as before, and her scent had mellowed to sympathy. Turo lifted her up onto the edge of the aqueduct. The Shonchan emptying fork root into the thing, a tall fellow with almost as many scars as Mishima, nearly dropped his sack. And she grimaced faintly before swinging her legs over and lowering herself into the water with a small gasp. It must have been cold. Ducking her head, she moved out of sight toward Malden. Fiorin climbed in after her, then Terrell, and finally Robert. They had to bend sharply to fit under the roof of the aqueduct. Elias clapped Perrin on the shoulder before hoisting himself up. "Should have trimmed my beard short like yours to keep it out of that," he said, gazing down at the water. That graying beard, ruffled by the breeze, spread across his chest. For that matter, his hair, gathered at the back of his neck with a leather cord, hung to his waist. He carried a small bundle of food and a water skin, too. "Still, a cold bath helps a man keep his mind off his troubles." "I thought that was for keeping your mind off women," Perrin said. He was in no mood for joking, but he could not expect everyone to be as grim as he was. Elias laughed. "What else causes a man's troubles?" He disappeared into the water, and Talonvor replaced him. Perrin caught his dark coat sleeve. "No heroics, mind." He had been of two minds about letting the man be part of this. "No heroics, my lord," Talonvor agreed. For the first time in a long time, he looked eager. The smell of him quivered with eagerness, but there was an edge of caution in it, too. That caution was the only reason he was not back in their camp. "I won't put Megden at risk, or the Lady Fael. I just want to see Megden that much quicker." Perrin nodded and let him go. He could understand that. Part of him wanted to climb into the aqueduct, too, to see Fael again that much quicker. But every piece of the work had to be done properly, and he had other tasks. Besides, if he were actually inside Malden, he was not sure how he could restrain himself from trying to find her. He could not catch his own scent, of course, but he doubted there was any caution in it now. The windmill heads turned again with loud squeaks as the wind shifted back. At least it never seemed to die up here. Any stoppage of the water flow would be disastrous. The ridgetop was becoming crowded now. 20 of Fael's hangers-on were waiting their turn at the aqueduct, all that remained save the two who were spying on Messima. The women wore men's coats and breeches and had their hair cut short, except for a tail at the back in imitation of the Aiel, though no Aiel would have worn sword as they did. Many of the Tyran men had shaved their beards because Aiel did not wear them. Behind them, 52 Rivers men carried halberds and unstrung bows, their bowstrings safely tucked away inside their coats, and each with 3 bristling quivers tied to his back along with a parcel of food. Every man in the camp had volunteered for this, and Perrin had to let them choose lots. He had considering doubling the number or more. Hangers-on and 2 Rivers men had their bundles of food in their water skins. The constant flow of Shanshan soldiers continued, carrying full sacks up the slope and empty sacks back down. They were disciplined. When a man slipped in the mud and fell, as happened with some regularity, there was no cursing or even mutters. They just got up and went ahead. Salan de Derengil, wearing a dark coat with 6 horizontal stripes of color across the chest, stopped to offer Perrin her hand. She only came up to his chest, but Elias claimed she handled the sword at her hip credibly. Perrin no longer thought she and the others were fools, well, not all the time, in spite of their attempts to copy Aiel ways. With differences, of course. The tail of dark hair at Salanda's nape was tied with a length of dark ribbon. There was no fear in her scent, only determination. "Thank you for allowing us to be part of this, my lord," she said in precise Carianan accent. "We will not let you down, or the Lady Fail." "I know you won't," he said, shaking her hand. There had been a time when she had been pointed about serving Fail and not him. He shook the hand of every one of them before they climbed into the aqueduct. They all smelled determined. So did Ban Alcine, who commanded the 2 Rivers men going into Malden. "When Fail and the others come, wedge the outer doors shut, Ban." Perrin had told him this before, but he could not help repeating himself. "Then see if you can get them back up the aqueduct." That fortress had not kept the Shido out the first time, and if anything went wrong, he doubted it would keep them out this time either. He did not mean to renege on his bargain with the Shanshan. The Shido were going to pay for what they had done to Fayu, and besides, he could not leave them behind to continue ravaging the countryside. But he wanted her out of harm's way as soon as possible. Ban propped his bowstave and halberd against the aqueduct and hoisted himself up to reach a hand down inside. When he lowered himself back to the ground, he wiped his damp hand on his coat, then rubbed the side of his prominent nose. "Below the water, it's coated with something feels like pond slime. We're going to have a hard enough time getting down that last slope without sliding the whole way, Lord Perrin, much less trying to climb it again. I expect the best thing is to wait in that fortress till you reach us." Perrin sighed. He had thought of sending ropes, but they would have needed nearly 2 miles of it to span that last slope. A lot to be carried, and if any Shido spotted the butt end of it in the Malden end of the aqueduct, they would search every nook and cranny in the town. A small risk, perhaps, yet the bitter loss that might result made it loom large. "I'll be there as fast as I can, Ban. I promise you that." He shook hands with every one of them, too. Lantern-jawed Todd Elkar, and Leof Torfin, with a white streak through his hair where a scar ran, given to him by Trollocs. Young Kenley Merrin, who was making a stab at growing a beard again, unfortunately, and Billy Adara, who was almost as white as Perrin, if a hand shorter. Billy was a distant cousin, and some of the closest kin Perrin had living. He had grown up with many of these men, though some were a few years older than he. Some were a few years younger, too. By now, he knew the men from down to Devon Ride and up to Watch Hill as well as he did those from around Emmons Field. He had more reason than Fail alone to reach that fortress as fast as he could. Had Alora, a lean fellow with thick mustaches like a Terrabanner, was the last of the 2 Rivers men. As he climbed into the aqueduct, Gaul appeared, face still veiled and 4 spears gripped in the hand that held his bullhide buckler. He put a hand on the edge of the aqueduct and leapt up to sit on the stone coping. "You're going in?" Perrin said in surprise. "The maidens can do any scouting you need, Perrin Barra." The big Aiel glanced over his shoulder toward the maidens. Perrin thought he scowled, though it was hard to be sure because of the black veil that hid all but his eyes. "I heard them talking when they thought I was not listening. Unlike your wife and the others, Chiad, is properly Guy Shine. Bane, too, but I care nothing about her. Chiad still has the rest of her year and a day to serve after we rescue her. When a man has a woman as Guy Shine, or a woman a man, sometimes a marriage wreath is made as soon as white is put off. It is not uncommon. But I heard the maidens say they would reach Chiad first, to keep her from me. Behind him, Sulan's finger flashed in maiden hand talk, and one of the others slapped a hand over her mouth as if stifling laughter. So they had been goading him. Maybe they were not so hard against his suit for Chiad as they pretended. Or maybe there was something Terran was missing. Aiel humor could be rough. Gaul slipped into the water. He had to bend almost parallel to the surface to get under the aqueduct's top. Perrin stared at the opening. So easy to follow, Gaul. Turning away was hard. The line of Shanshan soldiers still snaked up and down the slope. Mishima, I'm going back to my camp. Grady will take you to yours when you're done here. Do what you can to blur the tracks before you go. Very well, my lord. I've told off some men to scrape grease from the axles and grease these windmills. They sound as if they could seize up any minute. We can do those at the far ridge, too. Taking up Stepper's reins, Perrin looked up at the slow-turning sails. Slow but steady. They had never been made to turn fast. And if Shido decide to come out here tomorrow and wonder where the fresh grease came from? Mishima regarded him for a long moment, his face half hidden by moon shadows. For once, he did not seem put off by glowing yellow eyes. His scent, he smelled as if he saw something unexpected.
Well, let's get the
Banner General was right about
Let's get
you,
this out.
He said slowly. What did she say? You'll have to ask her, my lord. Perrin rode down the slope and back to the trees, thinking how easy it would be to turn around. Galen could handle everything from here. It was all laid out, except that the Mayenne believed every battle climaxed with a grand charge of horse, and preferably began with one, too. How long would he stick to the plan? Arganda was more sensible, but he was so anxious for Queen Aleandra that he might well order that charge as well. That left himself. The breeze gusted hard, and he pulled his cloak around him. Grady, elbows on his knees, was in a small clearing, sitting on a half-lit mossy stone that was partially sunken into the ground, and no doubt left over from building the aqueduct. A few others like it stood around. The breeze kept his scent from Perrin's nose. He did not look up until Perrin drew rein in front of him. The gateway they had used to come here still stood open, showing another clearing among tall trees, not far from where the Shanshan were now camped. It might have been easier to have had them set up close to Perrin's camp, but he wanted to keep the Aes Sedai and Wise Ones as far from the Suldam and Damani as possible. He was not afraid of the Shanshan breaking Tylee's word, but the Aes Sedai and Wise Ones practically came down with the pip just thinking about Damani. Probably the Wise Ones and the Nura would stay their hands for the time being. Probably. The story he was not so sure of, in a number of ways. Better to keep a few leagues between them for as long as it could be managed. Are you all right, Grady? The man's weathered face seemed to have new lines in it. That might have been a trick of moon shadows cast by the trees, but Perrin did not think so. The carts had passed through the gateway easily, but was it a little smaller than the first he had seen Grady make? Just a little tired, my lord, Grady said wearily. He remained seated with his elbows on his knees. All this traveling we've been doing lately. Well, I couldn't have held the gateway open long enough for all those soldiers to ride through yesterday. That's why I've taken to tying them off. Perrin nodded. Both of the Ashaman were tired. Channeling took strength out of a man as surely as swinging a hammer all day at a forge. More so, in truth. The man with the hammer could keep going far longer than any Ashaman. That was why the aqueduct was the route into Malden and not a gateway. Why there would be no gateway to bring Fail and the others out again, much as Perrin wished there could be. The two Ashaman only had so much more left in them until they could rest, and that little had to be used where it was needed most. Light, but that was a hard thought. Only if Grady on the Ald fell one gateway short of what was needed, a lot of men were going to die. A hard decision. I'm going to need you in the Ald the day after tomorrow. That was like saying he needed air. Without the Ashaman, everything became impossible. You're going to be busy then. Another gross understatement. Busy as a one-armed man plastering a ceiling, my lord. Are you up to it? Have to be, don't I, my lord? Perrin nodded again. You did what had to be done. Send me back to our camp. After you return Mishima and his people to his, you and the maidens can sleep there if you'd like. That would spare Grady a little against 2 days from now. Don't know about the maidens, my lord. I had as soon come on home tonight. He turned his head to look at the gateway without rising, and it dwindled in the reverse of how it had opened. The view through it seemed to rotate as it narrowed, finishing with a vertical slash of silvery blue light that left a faint purplish bar in Perrin's vision when it winked out.
I'll be right back.
Those demoni fair make my skin crawl. They don't want to be free. How would you know that? I talked to some of them when none of those Suldam was close by. Soon as I brought up maybe they'd like those leashes off, just hinting like, they started screaming for the Suldam. The demoni were crying and the Suldam petting them and stroking them and glaring daggers at me. Fair made my skin crawl. Stepper stamped an impatient hoof, and Perrin patted the stallion's neck. Grady was lucky those Suldam had let him go with a whole hide. Whatever happens with the demonic, Grady, it won't be this week or next, and it won't be us who fixes it. So you let the demonic be. We have a job of work in front of us that needs doing. And a deal with the Dark One to do it. He pushed the thought away. Anyway, it had grown hard to think of Tali Kirgan being on the Dark One's side, or Mishima.
No, I gotta get some.
You understand that? I understand, my lord. I'm just saying it makes my skin crawl. At last, another silvery blue slash appeared, widening into an opening that showed a clearing among large, widely spaced trees and a low stone outcrop. Leaning low on Stepper's neck, Perrin rode through. The gateway winked out behind him, and he rode on through the trees until he came to the large clearing where the camp lay.
Oh, that's
in
better.
the tiny village of Britain.
Had to put the pillow back down on the seat.
The most rain-soaked night could not tempt a man into. The sentries up in the trees gave no warnings, of course. They recognized him. He wanted nothing so much as he wanted his blankets right then. Well, Fail certainly, but lacking her, he wanted to be alone in the dark. Likely he would fail to find sleep again, but he would spend the night as he had so often before, thinking of her, remembering her. Short of the 10-pace wide thicket of sharpened stakes that surrounded the camp, though, he reined in. A rocken was crouched just outside the stakes, its long gray neck lowered so a woman in a hooded brown coat could scratch its leathery snout. Her hood hung down her back, revealing short-cropped hair and a hard, narrow face. She looked at Perrin as if she recognized him, but went right on scratching. The saddle on the creature's back had places for 2 riders. A messenger had come, it seemed. He turned into one of the narrow, angled lanes, through the stakes that had been left to allow horses through. Just not quickly. Most everybody had turned in already. He sensed movement on the horse lines in the heart of the camp, likely some of the Kyrianan grooms or farriers, but the patched canvas tents and small huts of woven evergreen branches, now long since brown, lay dark and quiet. Nothing moved among the low Aiel tents, and only a few sentries walking up and down in the nearest Mayenner section of the camp. The Mayenners and Gael Dannon put little trust in the 2 Rivers men in the trees. His tall, red-striped tent was alight, however, and the shadows of a number of people shifted on the tent walls. When he climbed down in front of the tent, Athen Chandin appeared to take the reins and knuckle his forehead while he hunched a sort of bow. Athen was a good bow shot, or he would not have been here, but he had a truckling manner. Perrin went in unpinning his cloak. There you are, Verlaine said brightly. She must have dressed hastily because her long black hair looked as though it had just had a lick and a promise from a brush, but her high-necked gray riding dress appeared neat and fresh. Her serving women never let her don anything unless it was freshly ironed. She held out a silver wine cup for Brianna to refill from a long-necked wine pitcher, which the Kyrianan woman did with a grimace. Fail's maid disliked Berelaine with a passion. Berelaine seemed not to notice, though. "Forgive me for entertaining in your tent, but the Banner General wanted to see you, and I thought I'd keep her company. She's been telling us about some white cloaks." Bulwer was standing unobtrusively in a corner. The bird-like little man could be as unnoticeable as a lizard on a branch when he wished to be, but his scent sharpened at the mention of white cloaks. Ty Lee, her shoulders straining a coat like that of the flyer, made a straight-legged bow while keeping one eye on Nora. She seemed to believe that Aes Sedai might turn into ravening wild dogs at any moment. Perrin thought she smelled of distress, though none showed on her dark face. "My lord, I have 2 pieces of news I felt I had to bring you immediately. Have you begun putting the fork root into the town's water?" "I have," he said worriedly, tossing his cloak down atop one of the brass-banded chests. Ty Lee sighed. "I told you I would. I'd have done it 2 days ago if that fool woman in Almazar hadn't dragged her heels so." "What's happened?" "Forgive me," Linny announced, "but I was roused from my blankets, and I would like to return to them. Does anyone require anything else of me tonight?" There were no curtsies or milords from the frail-appearing woman with her white hair in a loose braid for sleeping. Unlike with Berelaine, her brown dress looked hastily donned, unusual for her. Her scent was crisp and sharp with disapproval. She was one of those who believed the ridiculous tale that Perrin had slept with Berelaine on the very night after Fail had been captured. She managed to avoid looking at him while her gaze swept around the tent's interior. "I'll have some more wine," Aram announced, holding out his cup. Grim-faced and haggard in a red-striped coat, his eyes hollow, he was attempting to lounge in one of the folding camp chairs, but the sword strapped to his back made leaning against the gilt-edged back impossible. Brianna started toward him. "He's had enough," Linny said sharply, and Brianna turned away. Linny had a firm hand with Fail's servants. Aram muttered an oath and leaped to his feet, tossing his cup down on the flowered carpet that served as a floor. "I might as well go somewhere I won't have some old woman nagging at me every time I take a drink." He gave Perrin a sullen glare before stalking out of the tent, doubtless on his way to Massima's camp. He had pleaded to be one of the party sent him to Malden, but his hot head could not be trusted with that. "You can go, Linny," Berelaine said. "Brianna can look after us well enough." A snort was the acknowledgement Linny gave. She made it sound almost delicate, before she stalked out, stiff-backed and reeking of disapproval, and still not looking at Perrin. "Forgive me, my lord," Tyler drawled in careful tones, "but you seem to run your household more loosely than I'm accustomed to." "It's our way, Banner General," Perrin said, picking up Aram's cup. "No need to dirty another. Nobody around here is property. If that sounded sharp, so be it." He had come to like Ty Lee after a fashion, but these Seanchan had ways that would make a goat gag. He took the pitcher from Brianna. She actually tried to hold on to it for a moment, frowning at him as if she would deny him a drink, and poured for himself before handing it back. She snatched the pitcher out of his hand. "Now, what happened? What about these white cloaks?" "I sent Rakan out scouting as far as they could go just before dawn, and again just after sunset. One of the flyers tonight turned back sooner than expected. She saw 7,000 children of the light on the move not 50 miles from my camp." "On the move toward you?" Perrin frowned at his wine instead of drinking. 7,000 seems a very exact count to make in the dark. "It seems these men, they're deserters," Anura broke in. At least the Banner General sees them so. In gray silk, she appeared as neat as if she had spent an hour dressing. Her thrusting nose made her look like a crow wearing beaded braids as she peered at Tylee, and the Banner General a particularly interesting bit of carrion. She held a wine cup, but it seemed untouched. I have heard rumors that Pedron Nile died fighting the Shonchan, but apparently Imanvalda, who replaced Nile, swore fealty to the Shonchan Empress. Tylee mouthed, "May she live forever," under her breath. Perrin doubted anyone but himself heard. Bulwer opened his mouth too, but closed it again without speaking. The white cloaks were a bugbear to him. Something over a month ago, however, the Grey Sister went on, Galad Damadred killed Valda and led 7,000 white cloaks to lead the Shonchan cause. A pity he became enmeshed with white cloaks, but perhaps some good has come of it. In any case, it appears there is a standing order that these men are all to be killed as soon as found. I have summed it up nicely, yes, Banner General? Tylee's hand twitched, as if it wanted to make one of those signs against evil. That's a fair summing up, she said. To Perrin, not Anura. The Shonchan woman seemed to find speaking to an Aes Sedai difficult. Except the part about good coming of it. Oath-breaking and desertion can never be called good. I take it they're not moving toward you, or you'd have said. Perrin put a hint of question into that, though there was no question in his mind. North, Tylee answered. They're heading north. Bulwer half opened his mouth again, then shut it with a click of teeth. If you have advice, Perrin told him, then give it. But I don't care how many white cloaks desert the Shonchan. Fail is the only thing I care about. And I don't think the Banner General will give up the chance to follow 300 or 400 more demonics to chase after them. Berylane grimaced. Anora's face remained smooth, but she took a long swallow of her wine. None of the Aes Sedai felt very complacent about that part of the plan. None of the wise ones did either. I will not, Tylee said firmly. I think I'll take some wine after all. Brianna took a deep breath before moving to comply, and a hint of fear entered her scent. Apparently, the tall, dark woman intimidated her. I won't deny I would enjoy a chance to strike a blow at the White Cloaks, Bulwer said in that dry-as-dust voice. But in truth, I feel I owe this Galad Damadred a debt of gratitude. Perhaps his grudge was against this Valda personally. In any case, you have no need of my advice here. Events are in motion in Malden, and if they weren't, I doubt you'd hold back even a day. Nor would I have advised it, my lord. If I may be so bold, I am quite fond of the Lady Fail. You may, Perrin told him. Banner General, you said 2 pieces of news. The Shonchan took the proffered wine cup from Brianna and looked at him so levelly it was clear she was avoiding a glance at the others in the tent. May we speak alone? She asked quietly. Berylane glided across the carpet to rest a hand on his arm and smile up at him. Anura and I don't mind leaving, she said. Right, how could anyone believe there was anything between him and her? She was as beautiful as ever, true, yet the scent that reminded him of a hunting cat was so long gone from her smell that he barely remembered it. The bedrock of her scent was patience and resolve now. She had come to accept that he loved Fail and only Fail, and she seemed as determined to see Fail freed as he was. You can stay, he said. Whatever you have to say, Banner General, you can say in front of everyone here. Tylee hesitated, glancing at Anura. There are 2 large parties of Aiel heading toward Malden, she said at last, reluctantly. One to the southeast, one to the southwest. The Marat Rakan estimate they could be there in 3 days. Suddenly, everything seemed to ripple in Perrin's sight. He felt himself ripple. Brianna gave a cry and dropped the pitcher. The world rippled again, and Berylane clutched his arm. Tali's hand seemed frozen in that odd gesture, thumb and forefinger forming a crescent. Everything rippled for a third time, and Perrin felt as if he were made of fog, as if the world were fog with a high wind coming. Berylane shuddered, and he put a comforting arm around her. She clung to him, trembling. Silence and the scent of fear filled the tent. He could hear voices being raised outside, and they sounded afraid too. "What was that?" Tali demanded finally. "I don't know." Anura's face remained serene, but her voice was unsteady. "Light, I have no idea." "It doesn't matter what it was," Perrin told them. He ignored their stares. "In 3 days, it will all be over. That's all that matters." Fail was all that mattered.
The sun stood short of its noonday peak, but Fail already felt harassed. The water for Savannah's morning bath, she bathed twice a day now, had not been hot enough, and Fail had been beaten along with everyone else, although she and Alejandra had only been there to scrub the woman's back. More than 20 Wetlander Guy Shine had begged to be allowed to swear fealty just since sunrise. 3 had suggested rising up, pointing out that there were more Guy Shine in all these tents than Shido. They had seemed to listen when she pointed out that nearly all of the Aiel knew how to use a spear, while most of the Wetlanders were farmers or craftsfolk. Few had ever held a weapon, and fewer still used one. They had seemed to listen, but this was the first day anyone had suggested such a thing right after swearing. Usually they took several days to work themselves around to it. The pressure was building, toward a slaughter unless she could thwart it. And all this. "It is only a game, Fail Bashir," Roland said, towering over her as they walked along one of the muddy streets that wound through the Shido tents. He sounded amused, and a very small smile curved his lips. A beautiful man, to be sure. "A kissing game, you said?" She shifted the lengths of striped toweling folded over her arm to draw his attention. "I have work to do, and no time for games, especially kissing games." She could see a few Aiel, several of them men staggering drunk even at this hour, but most of the people in the street were Wetlanders wearing dirty Gaishine robes, or children splashing happily in the mud puddles left by the night's heavy rain. The street was thronged with men and women in mud-stained white, carrying baskets or buckets or pots. Some actually went about chores. There were so many Gaishine in the camp that there really was not enough work to go around. Shido from ordering what were seen as idle hands to some work or other. Hands stuck out of white sleeves, however, even if it was make work. To avoid having to dig useless holes in muddy fields, or scrub pots that were already clean, a good many of the Gaishine had taken to carrying something that made them look as if they were working. That did not help anyone avoid the real work, but it did help avert the other kind. Fail did not have to worry about that with most of the Shido, not so long as she wore those thick golden chains around her waist and neck, but the necklace and belt were inadequate for deterring wise ones. She had scrubbed clean pots for some of them, and sometimes had been punished for not being available when Savannah wanted her, thus the toweling. "We could start with a kissing game children play," he said, "though the forfeits in that are sometimes embarrassing. In the game adults play, the forfeits are fun. Losing can be as pleasant as winning." She could not help laughing. The man certainly was persistent. Suddenly she saw Galena hurrying through the crowd in her direction, holding her white silk robes up out of the mud, eyes searching avidly. Fail had heard the woman was allowed clothing again as of this morning. Of course, she had never been without the tall necklace and wide belt of gold and fire drops. A cap of hair less than an inch long covered her head, and of all things a large red bow was pinned in it. It seemed unlikely that was by the woman's choice. Only a face Fail could not put an age to convinced her that Galena really was Aes Sedai. Beyond that, she was unsure of anything about her except the danger she presented. Galena spotted her and stopped dead, hands kneading her robes. The Aes Sedai eyed Roland uncertainly. "I'll have to think on it, Roland." She was not about to chase him away until she was sure of Galena. "I need time to think." Women always want time to think. Think on forgetting your troubles in the pleasure of a harmless game. The finger he drew softly down her cheek before walking away made her shiver. To Aiel, touching someone's cheek in public was as much as a kiss. It surely had felt like a kiss to her. Harmless? Somehow she doubted that any game that involved kissing Roland would end with just kissing. Luckily, she would not have to find out or hide anything from Perrin if Galena proved true. If. The Aes Sedai darted to her as soon as Roland was gone. "Where is it?" Galena demanded, seizing her arm. "Tell me. I know you have it. You must have it." The woman sounded almost pleading. Thorava's treatment of her had shattered that fabled Aes Sedai composure. Fael shook off her grip. "First, tell me again that you will take my friends and me with you when you go. Tell me straight out, and tell me when you are going." "Don't you dare talk to me that way," Galena hissed. Fael saw black flecks floating in her vision before she realized that she had been slapped. To her surprise, she slapped the other woman back as hard as she could, staggering her. She refrained from putting a hand to her stinging face, but Galena rubbed her own cheek, her eyes wide with shock. Fael steeled herself, perhaps for a blow with the power or something worse, but nothing happened. Some of the passing Gaishain stared at them, but none stopped or even slowed. Anything that looked like a gathering of Gaishain would draw Shido eyes and earn punishments for everyone involved. "Tell me," she said again. "I will take you and your friends with me," Galena practically snarled, snatching her hand down. "I leave tomorrow, if you have it. If not, Savannah will know who you are within the hour." Well, that was certainly speaking straight out. "It's hidden in the town. I'll get it for you now." But as she turned, Galena grabbed her arm again. The Aes Sedai's eyes darted, and she lowered her voice as if suddenly concerned about being overheard. She sounded frightened. "No, I'll take no chances on anyone seeing. You'll give it to me tomorrow morning, in the town. We'll meet there, in the south end of the town. I'll mark the building with a red scarf." Fael blinked. The southern half of Malden was a burned-out shell. "Why there?" she asked incredulously. "Because no one goes there, fool. Because no one will see us." Galena's eyes were still darting. "Tomorrow morning, early. Fail me and you'll regret it." Gathering the skirts of her silk robe, she scurried away into the crowd. Fael frowned as she watched the woman go. She should have felt exultation, but she did not. Galena seemed almost a wild thing, unpredictable. Still, Aes Sedai could not lie. There seemed no way for her to wriggle out of her promise. And if she found one, there were still her own plans for an escape, though those seemed no further along, if much more dangerous than they had when first begun. Which left Roland and his kissing games. Galena had to prove true. She had to.
Chapter 27. A Plain Wooden Box. The midday Altaran sun was warm, though a gusting breeze sometimes whipped Rand's cloak. They had been on the hilltop for 2 hours now. A great mass of dark clouds creeping down from the north above blue-gray haze spoke of rain to come, and a cooling. Andor lay only a few miles in that direction, across low forested hills of oak and pine, leatherleaf and sour gum. That border had seen countless generations of cattle raids going in both directions. Was Elaine watching it rain in Camelin? That lay a good 150 leagues east, too far for her to be more than a faint presence in the back of his head. Avienda in Aradaman was fainter still. He had not considered that the wise ones would take her along. Still, she would be safe among tens of thousands of Aiel, as safe as Elaine behind Camelin's walls. Tideshar stamped a hoof and tossed his head, eager to be moving. Rand patted the big black's neck. The stallion could reach the border in under an hour, but their way was west today. A short way west, in just a short while now. He had to impress at today's meeting, and he had chosen his garb with care. The crown of swords sat on his head for more reason than making an impression, though. Half the small swords nestled among the wide band of laurel leaves pointed down, making it uncomfortable to wear, giving constant reminders of its weight in gold and in responsibility. A small chip in one of those laurel leaves dug at his temple to remind him of the battle against the Shonchan, where it had been made. A battle lost where he could not afford to lose. His dark green silk coat was embroidered in gold on the sleeves, shoulders, and high collar. A gold inlaid buckle in the shape of a dragon fastened his sword belt, and he had the dragon scepter in hand, a 2-foot length of spearhead with a long green and white tassel below the polished steel point. If the daughter of the Nine Moons recognized it for part of a Shonchan spear, she must also see the dragons that maidens had carved winding around the remaining haft. Today he wore no gloves. The golden-maned dragon heads on the backs of his hands glittered metallically in the sun. However high she stood among the Shonchan, she would know whom she faced. "A fool!" Lews Theron's wild laughter echoed inside his head. "A fool to walk into a trap!" Rand ignored the madman. It might be a trap, but he was ready to spring it if it was. It was worth the risk. He needed his truce. He could crush the Shonchan, but at what cost in blood and in time he might not have. He glanced north again. The sky above Andor was clear except for a few high white clouds, drifting wisps. The last battle was coming. He had to take the risk. Min, toying with the reins of her gray mare nearby, was feeling smug, and that irritated him. She had inveigled a promise from him in a weak moment and refused to release him. He could just break it. He should break it. As if she had heard his thoughts, she looked at him. Her face, surrounded by dark shoulder-length ringlets, was smooth, but the bond suddenly carried suspicion and hints of anger. She seemed to be trying to suppress both, yet she adjusted the cuffs of her ornately embroidered red coat the way she did when checking her knives. Of course, she would not use one of those blades on him. Of course not. "A woman's love can be violent," Lews Theron murmured. "Sometimes they hurt a man worse than they think they have, worse than they mean to. Sometimes they're even sorry afterwards." He sounded sane for the moment, but Rand shoved the voice down. "You should let us scout further out, Randall Thor," Dandara said. She and the 24 other maidens on the sparsely wooded hilltop wore their black veils up. Some had their bows in hand and arrows nocked. The rest of the maidens were among the trees, well out from the hill, keeping watch against unpleasant surprises. "The land is clear all the way to the manor house, but this still smells of a trap to me." There had been a time when words like manor and house sounded awkward on her tongue. She had been a long time in the wetlands now, though. "Dandara speaks truth," Olivia muttered sullenly, heeling her roan gelding closer. Apparently the golden-haired woman still resented the fact that she would not be going with him, but her reaction to hearing her native accents in Tyr made that impossible. She admitted having been shaken, but claimed it had been the surprise of the thing. He could not chance it, though. "You cannot trust any of the high blood, especially a daughter of the Empress. May she—" Her mouth snapped shut, and she smoothed her dark blue skirts unnecessarily, grimacing at what she had almost said. He trusted her, literally with his life, but she had too many deep-buried instincts to risk putting her face to face with the woman he was going to meet. The bond carried anger with no effort to suppress it now. Min disliked seeing Olivia near him. "It smells of a trap to me, too," Bashir said, easing his sinuously curved sword in its scabbard. He was plainly clad in burnished helmet and breastplate, his gray silk coat alone marking him out from the 81 Saldean lancers arrayed around the hilltop. His thick, down-curved mustaches almost bristled behind the face bars of his helmet. "I'd give 10,000 crowns to know how many soldiers she has out there, and how many Damani. This daughter of the Nine Moons is the heir to their throne, man." He had been shocked when Olivia revealed that. No one in Abu Dar had mentioned it to him, as if it were of no importance. "They may claim their control ends far south of here, but you can wager she has at least a small army to see her to safety." "And if our scouts find this army," Rand replied calmly, Can we be sure they won't be seen? Nandera made a scornful sound. Best not to assume you're the only one with eyes, he told her. If they think we're planning to attack them or kidnap the woman, everything falls apart. Maybe that was why they had kept their secret. The Imperial heir would be a more tempting target for a kidnapping than a mere high-ranking noblewoman. You just keep watch to make sure they don't catch us by surprise. If it all goes wrong, Bashir, you know what to do. Besides, she may have an army, but so do I. And not so small. Bashir had to nod at that. Aside from the Saldeans and the maidens, the hilltop was crowded with Ashaman and Aes Sedai and warders, better than 25 all told, and as formidable a group as any small army. They mingled with surprising ease, and few outward signs of tension. Our Tovane, a short coppery-skinned red, was scowling at Loghain, but Gabrella, a dusky brown with sooty green eyes, was talking with him quite companionably, perhaps even coquettishly. That might have been the reason for Tovane's scowl, though disapproval seemed more likely than jealousy. Adriel and Curran each had an arm around the other's waist, though she was tall enough to overtop the Damani Ashaman, and beautiful where he was plain and had gray at his temples. Not to mention that he had bonded the gray against her will. Beldine knew enough to the shawl that she simply looked like any young Saldean woman, with slightly tilted brown eyes, reached out every now and then to touch Manfor, and he smiled at her whenever she did. Her bonding of him had been a shock, but apparently the yellow-haired man had been more than willing. Neither had asked Rand his opinion before the bonding. Strangest of all, perhaps, was Janera, pale and sturdy in a gray riding dress embroidered with red on the skirts, and Kajima, a clerkish fellow in his middle years who wore his hair like Narishma, in 2 braids with silver bells at the ends. She laughed at something Kajima said, and murmured something that made him laugh in turn. A red, joking with a man who could chill? Maybe Taim had effected a change for the better, whatever he had intended. And maybe Rand al'Thor was living in a dream too. Aes Sedai were famous for their dissembling. But could a red dissemble that far? Not everyone felt agreeable today. Ayako's eyes seemed almost black as she glared at Rand, but then considering what happened to a warder when his Aes Sedai died, the dark-complected little white had reason to fear Sandemir going into possible danger. The Ashaman bond differed from the warder bond in some respects, but in others it was identical, and no one yet knew the effects of an Ashaman's death on the woman he had bonded. Elza was frowning at Rand, too, one hand on the shoulder of her tall, lean warder Firo, as if she were gripping a guard dog's collar and thinking of losing him. Not against Rand, certainly, but he worried for anyone she thought might be threatening him. He had given her orders about that, and her oath should see them obeyed. Yet Aes Sedai could find loopholes in almost anything. Nerys was speaking firmly to Narishma, with her 2 other warders sitting their horses a little way off. There was no mistaking the way the stern-faced woman gestured as she spoke, leaning close to him so she could speak in a low voice. She was instructing him about something. Rand disliked that in the circumstances, yet there seemed little he could do. Nerys had sworn no oaths, and she would ignore him when it came to one of her warders, or much of anything else for that matter. Cadsuane was watching Rand too. She and Nynaeve were wearing all of their Tirangrial jewelry. Nynaeve was making a good try at Aes Sedai calm. She seemed to practice that a great deal since sending Lan wherever she had sent him. Half the hilltop separated her plump brown mare from Cadsuane's bay, of course. Nynaeve would never admit it, but Cadsuane intimidated her. Loghain rode up between Rand and Bashir, his black gelding prancing. The horse was almost the exact shade of his coat and cloak. "The sun is almost straight overhead," he said. "Time we go down?" There was only a mere hint of question in that. The man chafed at taking orders. He did not wait on a reply. "Sandemir," he called loudly. "Narishma!" Nerys held Narishma by his sleeve for another moment of instructions before letting him ride over, which made Loghain scowl. Sundark Narishma, with his dark belled braids, looked years younger than Rand, though he was a few years older in truth. Sitting as dun and straight as a sword, he nodded to Logain as to an equal, producing another scowl. Sandomir spoke a quiet word to Ayako before mounting his dapple, and she touched his thigh once he was in the saddle. Wrinkled, with receding hair and a gray-streaked beard trimmed to a point and oiled, he made her appear youthful rather than ageless. He wore the red and gold dragon on his high black collar now, as well as the silver sword. Every Ashaman on the hill did, even Manfor. He had only recently been raised to dedicated, but he had been one of the first to come to the Black Tower before there was a Black Tower. Most of the men who had begun with him were dead. Even Logain had not denied he deserved it. Logain had enough sense not to call Cadsuane or Nynaeve, but they rode to join Rand anyway, placing themselves to either side of him, each briefly eyeing him, faces so smooth they might have been thinking anything. Their eyes met, and Nynaeve looked away quickly. Cadsuane gave a faint snort. And Min came, too. Here's one more to balance the honors. A man should never give promises in bed. He opened his mouth, and she arched an eyebrow, looking at him very directly. The bond felt full of something dangerous. You stay behind me once we get there, he told her, not at all what he had intended to say. Danger faded to what he had come to recognize as love. There was wry amusement in the bond, too, for some reason. I will if I want to, you wool-headed sheep-herder, she said with more than a little asperity, just as if the bond would not tell him her true feelings, hard as those might be to decipher. If we're going to do this fool thing, let's get it done with, Cadsuane said firmly, and heeled her dark bay down the hill. A short distance from the hill, farms began to appear along a meandering dirt road through the forest, hard-packed by long years of use, but still carrying a slick of mud from the last rainfall. The chimneys of thatched stone houses smoked with the midday meal cooking. Sometimes girls and women sat out in the sun at their spinning wheels. Men in rough coats walked in the stone-walled fields, checking their sprouting crops amid boys hoeing weeds. The pastures held brown and white cattle or black-tailed sheep, usually watched by a boy or two with bows or slings. There were wolves in these forests, and leopards and other things that enjoyed the taste of beef and mutton. Some people shaded their eyes to peer at the passers-by, doubtless wondering who these finely dressed folk were who had come to visit the Lady Deirdre. Surely there could be no other reason for their presence, heading toward the manor house and so far from anywhere important. No one seemed agitated or frightened, though, just going about their day's work. Rumors of an army in the region surely would have upset them, and rumors of that sort spread like wildfire. Strange. The Shonchan could not travel and arrive without news speeding ahead of them. It was very strange. He felt Logain and the other two men see Sayadin, filling themselves with it. Logain held almost as much as he could have himself, Narishma and Sandomir somewhat less. They were the strongest among the other Ashaman, though, and both had been at Dumai's wells. Logain had proven he could handle himself in other places, other battles. If this was a trap, they would be ready, and the other side would never know it until too late. Rand did not reach for the source. He could feel Lews Therin lurking in his head. This was no time to give the madman a chance to get hold of the power. Cadsuane, Nynaeve, you'd better embrace the source now, he said. We're getting close. I've been holding Saidar since back on that hill, Nynaeve told him. Cadsuane snorted and gave him a look that called him an idiot. Rand stilled a grimace before it could begin. His skin felt no tingling, no goosebumps. They had masked their ability, and with it, shielded him from sensing the power in them. Men had had few advantages over women when it came to channeling, but now they had lost those few, while women retained all of theirs. Some of the Ashaman were trying to puzzle out how to duplicate what Nisela had created, to find a weave that would allow men to detect women's weaves, but so far without success. Well, it would have to be dealt with by someone else. He had all he could manage on his plate at the moment. The farms continued, some alone in a clearing, others clustered 3 or 4 or 5 together. If they followed the road far enough, they would reach the village of King's Crossing in a few miles, where a wooden bridge spanned a narrow river called the Rachal. But well short of that, the road passed by a large clearing marked by a pair of tall stone gateposts, though there were neither gates nor fence. 100 paces or more beyond it, at the end of a mud-slicked clay lane, lay Lady Deirdre's manor, 2 stories of thatch-roofed gray stone, saved from looking a large farmhouse only by the gateposts and the tall twin doors at the front. The stables and outbuildings had the same practical appearance, sturdy and unornamented. There was no one in sight, no stableman, no servant on her way to fetch eggs, no men in the fields that flanked the lane. The house's tall chimneys stood smokeless. It did smell of a trap, but the countryside was quiet, the farmers unruffled. There was only one way to find out. Rand turned Tadaishar in through the gateposts, and the others followed. Min did not heed his warning. She pushed her gray in between Tadaishar and Nynaeve's mare and grinned at him. The bond carried nervousness, but the woman grinned. When he was halfway to the house, the doors opened and 2 women came out, one in dark gray, the other in blue, with red panels on her breast and ankle-length skirts. Sunlight glinted off the silvery leash connecting them. 2 more appeared, and 2 more, until 3 pairs stood in a row to either side of the door. As he reached the 3/4 point, another woman stepped into the doorway, very dark and very small, dressed in pleated white, her head covered by a transparent scarf that fell over her face. The daughter of the 9 moons. She had been described to Bashir right down to her shaven head. A tension in his shoulders he had not been aware of melted. That she was actually here did away with the possibility of a trap. The Shongshan would not risk the heir to their throne in anything so dangerous. He drew rein and dismounted. "One of them is channeling," Nynaeve said, just loudly enough for him to hear as she climbed down from her saddle. "I can't see anything, so she's masked her ability and inverted the weave, and I wonder how the Shongshan learned that. But she's channeling. Only one. There isn't enough for it to be 2. Her Tirangrial could not tell whether it was Saidin or Saidar being channeled, but it was unlikely to be a man. "I told you it was a trap," Luce Theron groaned. "I told you." Rand pretended to check his saddle girth. "Can you tell which one?" he asked quietly. He still did not reach for Saidin. There was no telling what Luce Theron might do in these circumstances if he managed to grab control again. Logain was fiddling with his girth too, and Narishma was watching Sandomir check one of the Dapple's hooves. They had heard. The small woman was waiting in the doorway, very still, but no doubt impatient and likely offended by their apparent interest in their horses. "No," Cadswain replied grimly, "but I can do something about it, once we're closer." Her golden hair ornaments swayed as she tossed her cloak back as though unmasking a sword. "Stay behind me," he told Min, and to his relief she nodded. Her face wore a small frown, and the bond carried worry. Not fear, though. She knew he would protect her. Leaving the horses standing, he started toward the Suldam and Damani, with Cadswain and Nynaeve a little distance to either side of him. Logain, hand resting on his sword hilt, as if that were his real weapon, strode along on the other side of Cadswain, Narishma and Sandomir beyond Nynaeve. The small dark woman began walking toward them slowly, holding her pleated skirts up off the damp ground. Abruptly, no more than 10 paces away, she flickered. For an instant she was taller than most men, garbed all in black, surprise on her face, and though she still wore the veil, her head was covered with short-cut wavy black hair. Only an instant before the small woman returned, her step faltering as she let her white skirts fall. But another flicker, and the tall dark woman stood there, her face twisted in fury behind the veil. He recognized that face, though he had never seen it before. Luce Theron had, and that was enough. "Semirog," he said in shock before he could stop the word, and suddenly everything seemed to happen at once. He reached for the source and found Luce Theron clawing for it too, each of them jostling the other aside from reaching it. Semirog flicked her hand, and a small ball of fire streaked toward him from her fingertips. She might have shouted something, an order. He could not leap aside, Min stood right behind him. Frantically trying to seize Saidin, he flung up the hand holding the dragon scepter in desperation. The world seemed to explode in fire. His cheek was pressed against the damp ground, he realized. Black flecks shimmered in his vision, and everything seemed faintly hazy, as if seen through water. Where was he? What had happened? His head felt stuffed with wool. Something was prodding him in the ribs. His sword hilt. The old wounds were a hard knot of pain just above that. Slowly, he realized he was looking at the dragon scepter, or what was left of it. The spear point and a few inches of charred haft lay 3 paces away. Small dancing flames were consuming the long tassel. The crown of swords lay beyond it. Abruptly it came to him that he could feel Saidin being channeled. His skin was goosebumps all over from Saidar being wielded. The manor house. Semirog! He tried to push himself up and collapsed with a harsh cry. Slowly he pulled a left arm that seemed all pain up where he could see his hand. See where his hand had been. Only a mangled, blackened ruin remained. A stub sticking out of a cuff that gave off thin streamers of smoke. But the power was still being channeled around him. His people were fighting for their lives. They might be dying. Min! He struggled to rise and fell again. As though thinking of her had summoned her, Min was crouching over him, trying to shield him with her body, he realized. The bond was full of compassion and pain. Not physical pain. He would have known if she had the smallest injury. She was feeling pain for him. Lie still, she said. You've been hurt. I know, he said hoarsely. Again he reached for Saidin, and for a wonder, this time Luce Theron did not try to interfere. The power filled him, and that gave him the strength to push himself to his feet one-handed, preparing several very nasty weaves as he did so. Careless of his muddy coat, Min gripped his good arm as though she were trying to hold him upright. But the fighting was over. Semirog was standing stiffly with her arms at her sides, her skirts pressed against her legs, doubtless wrapped up in flows of air. The hilt of one of Min's knives stood out from her shoulder, and she must have been shielded too, but her dark, beautiful face was contemptuous. She had been a prisoner before, briefly, during the War of the Shadow. She had escaped from high detention by frightening her jailers to the point that they actually smuggled her to freedom. Others had been injured more seriously. A short, dark Suldal and tall, pale-haired Damani, linked by an Edam, lay sprawled on the ground, staring up at the sun with already glazed eyes, and another pair were on their knees and clinging to one another, blood running down their faces and matting their hair. The other pairs stood as stiffly as Semirog, and he could see the shields on 3 of the Damani. They looked stunned. One of the Suldam, a slender, dark-haired young woman, was weeping softly. Narishma's face was bloodied too, and his coat appeared singed. So did Sandemir's, and a bone jutted through his left coat sleeve, white smeared with red, until Nynaeve firmly pulled his arm straight and guided the bone back into place. Grimacing in pain, he gave a guttural groan. She cupped her hands around his arm over the break, and moments later he was flexing his arm and moving his fingers and murmuring thanks. Loghain appeared untouched, as did Nynaeve and Cadsuane, who was studying Semirog the way a brown might study an exotic animal never before seen. Suddenly gateways began opening all around the manor house, spilling out mounted Ashaman and Aes Sedai and warders, veiled maidens and Bashir riding at the head of his horsemen. An Ashaman and Aes Sedai in a ring of 2 could make a gateway considerably larger than those Rand could alone. So someone had managed to give the signal, a red sunburst in the sky. Every Ashaman was full of Saidin, and Rand assumed the Aes Sedai were equally full of Saidar. The maidens began spreading out into the trees. Agan! Hamad! Search the house! Bashir shouted. Mattoon! Form the lances! They'll be on us as soon as they can! 2 soldiers thrust their lances into the ground and leapt down to run inside, drawing their swords, while the others began arraying themselves in 2 ranks. Ayako flung herself from her saddle and rushed to Sandemir, not even bothering to hold her skirts on the mud. Nerys rode to Narishma before swinging down right in front of him and taking his head in her hands without a word. He jerked, his back arching and nearly pulling his head free as she healed him. She had little facility with Nynaeve's method of healing. Ignoring the turmoil,
Yeah,
Nynaeve
be right
gathered
back.
her skirts in bloody hands and hurried to Rand. "Oh, Rand," she said when she saw his arm. "I'm so sorry. I'll do what I can, but I can't fix it the way it was." Her eyes were filled with anguish. Wordlessly, he held out his left arm. It throbbed with agony. Strangely, he could still feel his hand. It seemed he should be able to make a fist with the fingers that were no longer there. His goosebumps intensified as she drew more deeply on Saidar. The tendrils of smoke vanished from his cuff, and she gripped his arm above the wrist. His entire arm began tingling, and the pain drained away. Slowly, blackened skin was replaced by smooth skin that seemed to ooze down until it covered the small lump that had been the base of his hand. It was a miraculous thing to see. The scarlet and gold scaled dragon grew back too, as much as it could, ending in a bit of the golden mane. He could still feel the whole hand. "I'm so sorry," Nynaeve said again. "Let me delve you for any other injuries," she asked, but did not wait.
All right, everyone. I'm gonna call it Answers Life for tonight. I want to thank everyone who stops by, everyone who continues to stop by. I appreciate all your support. Till next time, everyone. Stay safe.